Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. The moose hunter looked up at the sound of brush popping about 100 yards away. He'd just spread a moose hide over some small poplars, but upon hearing the noise, he spotted movement in the brush about 100 yards uphill. Then he saw another one about 30 yards from the first. Fearing the animals moving through the brush were bears, he began yelling and waving his arms. The shrubs and bushes whipped and swayed as the bears continued toward him, focused on the scent of the moose carcass. Now regretting leaving his rifle at camp, he began looking at the trees around him. Knowing he would have only a few seconds before the bears reached his location, he positioned himself near a large birch tree and went for the lowest branch. Just as his lower leg left the ground, the brush exploded around him from two different directions. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. The Chilkat River Valley in early autumn looks almost too peaceful for what it is. North of Haines, Alaska, the river braids through wide gravel bars and muskeg flats, framed by snowy coastal range peaks and dark spruce forests. The air is cool and damp, with mornings that smell of glacial silt and wet willow. Cottonwoods and birch glow yellow along the banks, and the boggy ground is stitched with dwarf birch, Labrador tea, and low berry shrubs that carry the last blueberries and crowberries of the season. Moose wade through willow-choked muskeg. Wolves follow their tracks alongside creeks, and both black and brown bears drift in and out of the river corridor, fattening up before the long Chilkat winter settles in. Marty and Forrest Young Jr. spent the last half of September 1955 hunting the upper Chilkat, camping along the river and searching muskeg meadows and willow benches for bulls. For over a week, luck ran thin. On the second day, Forrest wounded a bull in heavy rain, dogged the blood trail until the weather washed it into nothing, and then went for days without seeing another legal set of antlers. Finally, they decided to push farther into the valley. They loaded their gear into a canoe, fired up a small outboard, and worked their way roughly 10 miles further upriver to an empty cabin deep in classic moose country. The Chilkat here spreads into a wide valley with back sloughs, willow islands, and long tongues of muskeg pushing out from the forest. They'd worried this spot might be crowded with other hunters, but when they arrived, the cabin stood empty and the riverbank was quiet. The only company was sign. Fresh moose tracks, stamped into the mud, willow tips browsed off, and enough scat to convince them they'd finally put themselves in the right place. The next morning proved it. In a patch of willow-crowded muskeg, only 2 miles from camp, they found 2 bull moose feeding with a handful of cows. The bulls tolerated each other instead of driving one another off, which meant the peak rut was still a week or so away. Both bulls were good animals. They shot them, dressed the carcasses, and spent the rest of the day ferrying meat back toward the cabin. They knew they were not alone in the forest. Brown bears roamed the Chilkat system in heavy numbers, moving through the same willow thickets and muskeg islands as moose and hunters. So Marty and Forrest did what experienced Alaskans do. They cached the remaining meat and draped the capes up in trees, high enough that a bear would have to work for it. Entrails and offal lay on the ground, and the men knew that sooner or later something big, hungry, and dangerous would find it. Even in the 1950s, the Chilkat River Corridor was known as serious bear country. Today, large portions of the valley are folded into parks and preserves that emphasize how rich the area is for wildlife, salmon and eagles. Brown bears work the river and tributaries when salmon are running. Black bears roam the same timbered slopes and berry patches as they try to avoid brown bears and humans. In good years, abundant food keeps most bears focused on fish and berries. In lean years, or late in the season, when easy food is running out, they pay much more attention to anything that smells like meat. By early autumn, when moose season is underway, brown bears get hungry as the valley comes alive with activity. Hunters slip quietly through willow and spruce, doing their best to move like ghosts. Bears follow scent trails left by gut piles, carcasses, and fish. In these conditions, surprise and competition at close range become the real dangers. On the last day of September, Marty loaded a canoe with meat and headed back to Haynes and Forrest's freezer. Forrest stayed behind to move more of the kill closer to camp. By the time Marty returned the next day, nearly everything had been ferried out of the woods, except for one thing, the hide from Marty's bull, which still hung in the fork of a birch tree at the original kill site, 10 or 12 feet off the ground. Sunday morning they split chores. Marty would go after grouse for a stew. Forrest would hike back alone to retrieve the hide. Both planned to be back in the cabin well before noon, ready to pack out and ride the river home. Fully aware that the moose hide would be a burdensome 80 pounds, Forrest decided to leave his rifle and hunting knife back at the camp to lighten up his load. When he reached the kill, it was obvious the bears had finally discovered what the hunters had left behind. The muskeg looked torn up, as if someone had raked it. 2 rounded mounds of grass and moss showed where a bear or bears had carefully covered the uneaten entrails of both moose, a classic sign of caching behavior. The air smelled of meat and bear urine and feces, deposited to ward off other animals. It should have been a screaming warning that he had walked into an active bear kitchen. For some reason, it didn't stop him. Now, I just want to ask you something real quick to put you in the mind of a bear. If you found some of your favorite food just left out, and you somehow, like me most of the time, just couldn't resist the temptation. Bears live and eat by what is detected by their noses. So logically, after eating its fill, a proper expectation would be that the bear would go sleep off a large meal upwind of where its food was cached. The wind carries both scent and sound to the bear as it rests and acts as an alarm to it to defend its cache. The hide was still up in the birch, untouched. He dropped his packboard at the base of the tree and glanced up to see where he would need to climb. Movement in the brush, some 300 feet away, caught his eye. 2 bears, roughly 30 feet apart, moving through the brush. From their color and build, he identified them as grizzlies, also called coastal brown bears. Up to that day, every bear he had met in the wild had chosen the same option, to run. He had no reason from his own experience to expect anything different now. Then one of the bears vanished, and the brush began to thrash. The bear came straight at him, crashing through the willow and alder, so explosively that the hunter could follow its line just by watching the shrubs whip and shudder. At first he still believed he could bluff his way out, waved his arms, shouted, and tried to look huge. The bear didn't slow. He'd made one fatal decision before walking out of the camp. He left his rifle behind. No rifle, no handgun, and not even a hunting knife. The only thing he meant to carry that morning was an 80-pound green moose hide. He'd traveled light to make the packing easier. With the brush exploding toward him, he realized there was only one option left. The birch tree that held Marty's hide offered the only height in reach. He jumped for a low branch and began climbing hand over hand. He didn't get far enough, fast enough. Before he'd climbed even his own height off the ground, the grizzly burst out of the brush and rushed to the base of the tree. The bear did not pause, did not bluff, and did not stop to huff or stamp a warning. It opened its jaws, clamped down on the back of his right leg just above the knee, and yanked him down with one savage jerk. He hit the muskeg on his back, and the two tangled. In a few heartbeats, the fight ended with the bear's left foreleg pinning both of Forrest's legs. The animal then began to work on him methodically. No longer a blur of motion, but something far worse, a slow, deliberate tearing. The grizzly bit into the inside of his thigh, below the crotch, and ripped away a long strip of flesh. Blood spurted. He braced on one elbow and punched the bear in the face with his free hand, hammering his fist into the big head over and over, until something in his hand cracked. It made no difference. The bear chewed onward, shredding wool pants, long underwear, skin, and muscle with every bite. His face lay less than a foot from the bear's, so close he could see long gray guard hairs bristling off its muzzle and catch the burning intensity of its eyes. The bear panted and slobbered as it worked on his legs. Its muzzle wrinkled into a grimace that seemed more anger than fear. Somewhere he had read that sometimes a person being mauled feels a numbing shock that dampens the pain. There was no numbness here. Every bite hurt, and he felt every puncture and tear. Time stretched into something strange. The mauling might have lasted seconds, or a full minute, but it felt endless. At some point, a desperate thought cut through the panic. If he kept struggling, he would die. His only hope was to convince the bear that he was no longer a threat and no longer worth finishing. He quit fighting, let his body go limp, and rolled just enough to present less of a target. The change was immediate. The bear stopped chewing and stood over him, still holding him to the ground with one foreleg. The hunter tried not to breathe, but a low, involuntary groan escaped. It cost him another wound. The grizzly clamped its teeth into his side, ripping loose a flap of flesh large enough to expose his bladder. The pain was blinding, yet he held still. Another bite raked his side, then the bear shifted positions, grabbed him across the back, below the right shoulder blade, and bit down with enough force to tear 3 ribs loose from the spine and punch a hole into the chest cavity. The teeth stopped just short of his kidneys. A little lower, he knew later, he would almost certainly have died, there in the muskeg. He did not move. He did not cry out. At last the bear dropped him and walked away. He lay perfectly motionless, afraid that even turning his head would bring the animal back. After a while the muskeg trembled under him, and he heard the heavy panting run again. The grizzly rushed in, stopped just short of him, and hovered nearby, breathing hard. It was the kind of approach a bear uses to test whether a downed animal is truly finished, but again the hunter held his possum act, as he later called it. The bear inspected him, then trotted away. Another time it charged in and stood so close he could see its lower legs and paws beside his face. Again it walked off without touching him. At last the forest fell quiet. As the minutes dragged on, a new problem emerged. The hole in his back and side made breathing difficult. Lying on his back, he felt blood and fluid building up in his throat. If he didn't move, he might drown. If he did move, the bear might still be near. Eventually, he chose the only option that offered any chance at all. He rolled carefully onto his face and let his mouth and nose drain. Nothing happened. The grizzly did not return, and after a while he began to believe, cautiously, that the worst might be over. The pain was immense and unrelenting. The bear had flayed the inside of his legs, ripped both buttocks open, torn one rib entirely free, and left 2 others protruding from the torn skin, crushed his right hand, and bitten him from shoulders to knees. Cold water seeped up through the muskeg, soaking and chilling him. Hours still lay between that moment and any hope of rescue. At some point, convinced that he was going to die long before help could arrive, a darker thought took hold. He gashed his own wrist with his pocket knife, but was unable to hit a major artery. He considered trying to hit an artery in his neck, but was afraid he would suffocate. Whatever he did, one thing became clear. Unless someone found him, the muskeg would be his grave. It was still late morning when the bear first struck. Hours later, Marty finally appeared, drawn by worry when the agreed-upon time came and went without the hide or his friend. Marty followed sign, found the shredded ground and forest, bleeding and lying in the muskeg. At first he thought he might try to carry the wounded hunter back to camp, but even the attempt to lift him sent waves of screaming pain through Forrest's body. They abandoned that idea. Instead, Marty made a quick trip to the cabin and returned with everything he could think of that might keep the man alive: a sleeping bag, an air mattress, a shotgun and shells, water, food, cigarettes, matches, and a gas lantern. He got his friend onto the mattress and into the bag, propped gear around him to block the cold drizzle that had started to fall, placed the shotgun within arm's reach, lit the lantern, promised to make the fastest trip any man had ever made to Haines, and left. Forrest could only hope he would still be breathing when Marty came back. From the moment of the first attack, around mid-morning, Until well after midnight, the wounded man lay in that muskeg patch, fighting waves of pain, cold, and fear. He knew Marty had to travel roughly 2 miles to the cabin, then many more miles by river and road in the dark to reach Haines, gather a rescue party, and come back. Best case, he told himself, help might arrive 8 or 9 hours later. Worst case, not at all. As the afternoon wore on, some of the worst pain dulled. Warmth seeped back into his body. For a while, he started to believe that he might actually make it. Then the ground shook again. The panting, snuffling sound he had come to dread rolled out of the brush. The big grizzly had returned, cautious now after its early encounter with human scent and gear. It rushed in, stopped a few feet away, roared, then backed away again, apparently unnerved by the strange glow of the lantern, the human smell, and the cluster of gear around the motionless figure. Later, a small black bear cub appeared out of the brush, then a second one, taking turns creeping closer and circling him with wide-eyed curiosity. Whether they belonged to another bear or not, he couldn't tell, but he knew one thing: where there are cubs, there's a mother. He hissed sharply to drive them off without triggering a panicked bawl. Time after time, they crept back in, then bolted away at the sound, keeping him on edge and waiting for a larger, more dangerous shape to emerge. Night finally fell. The lantern burned low, flickered, and died. The darkness that followed felt almost as bad as the bear. Without the small pool of light, the muskeg seemed to close in around him again. Full of imagined shapes and remembered pain, the panting came back. This time the grizzly approached slowly from behind his head, stalking rather than charging. The hunter could not see the animal, but he could hear every careful step in the brush. When he judged the sound close enough, he brought the shotgun up under the top of the sleeping bag, pointed it toward the noise, raised the muzzle above where he believed the bear's body would be, and fired into the night. The blast shattered the silence. The bear let out a strangled roar and crashed through the brush. A second time, later in the night, it circled from another direction, tested the strange scene again, with cautious steps and heavy breath, and again chose not to come too close. Other bears fed at the cached moose remains, growling and gnawing in the dark, but none of them stepped into the small circle of ground where the wounded man lay with the empty shotgun. Sometime close to midnight, he heard the faint thrum of an outdoor motor downriver, then another. The sounds faded and returned as boats scraped through shallow braids and dark channels. Finally, he heard voices in the brush. He struck a handful of matches in one flaring cluster and heard somebody shout that they had seen a light. Marty arrived with friends from Haines, among them men with combat injuries and first aid experience. They injected penicillin and morphine, loaded him onto a stretcher, and began the long, stumbling carry back to the cabin. It took over 3 hours to get him 2 miles in the dark. More than once they heard the big grizzly bawling in the distance, as though unwilling to surrender its broken prey, but it never came close enough to challenge a party of that size. By morning, a second rescue group had arrived by boat. Then an airboat came from downriver. At daylight, a physician and pilot pushed up the Chilkat. Meanwhile, word of the mauling reached farther afield. The rescue machinery of both Alaska and Canada spun up. A Royal Canadian Air Force helicopter at Whitehorse, roughly 100 miles away, was hastily reassembled from a partial overhaul, loaded with a doctor, a nurse, plasma, and drugs, and sent south. The big helicopter set down on the small clearing by the cabin, scooped the mauled hunter aboard, and flew him to Haines. From there, a Coast Guard aircraft carried him across Lynn Canal to a hospital in Juneau, where surgeons and nurses worked against the clock. By then his body bore over 100 tooth marks and countless gashes from shoulders to knees. Several ribs were broken, and one had been torn completely free. Parts of 2 others had to be removed. One shattered rib tip pressed against a lung, but, by sheer luck, had not punctured it. Massive infection and shock were real threats. Surgeons cleaned and closed what they could, removed damaged bone, patched muscle and skin, and supported him with blood and plasma. They later admitted that a man with such injuries usually would not live beyond 6 hours without major medical care. He'd waited much longer, yet he lived. He stayed in the hospital for weeks, left in early winter, 30 pounds underweight, missing 3 ribs, carrying scars that would never fade, and nursing a right hand that would never quite be the same size again. Still, he returned to work. Pain nagged him at times, but he carried on. The next year he went back to the same valley with Marty and with the very doctor who'd helped save his life. They built a cabin nearby, hunted again, and watched bear sign around fresh kills with new respect. Moose fell within a few hundred yards of where the bear had attacked him. One night, a bear knocked down the small stick fence they'd been told might keep predators away from a carcass, and sat in the sand, studying the tarp before leaving. The men quickly grabbed the meat, rifles at hand. Somewhere out there, he suspected, the big old grizzly, with the stiff gray whiskers, still walked. Alaska is home to one of the largest brown bear populations on Earth. Modern estimates from Alaska wildlife authorities place the statewide brown bear or grizzly population at roughly 30,000 animals, spread across most of the state, except a few outlying island chains and portions of the far southern southeast archipelago. Brown bear densities vary widely, from only a handful per 1,000 square kilometers in the sparse northern interior to very high numbers in rich coastal habitats with abundant salmon. Black bears are even more numerous. Current Alaska Department of Fish and Game information estimates around 100,000 black bears across the state, with especially high densities in forested coastal regions. In many parts of southeast and coastal south-central Alaska, both species overlap along major salmon rivers and estuaries. There, bears concentrate in the same corridors where people fish, hunt, boat, and travel. As for the bears' motives in the attack, several overlapping issues seem likely. The kill site where the hunter stood was heavily marked by bear activity. Entrails were cached under mounds of grass and moss. The scent of blood and meat lay strong over the muskeg. That suggests the grizzly viewed the area as an active food source. When the man walked in, dropped his pack, and stood under the birch where the hide hung, he effectively stepped into the middle of the bear's pantry. This was almost certainly not a surprise encounter at point-blank range in thick brush. The bear appears to have seen, scented, or heard him before committing. The first rush may have been a territorial or food defense attack, the kind of violent, sustained mauling that happens when a bear decides a human is competition for a carcass. Later passes, when the bear circled and tested his body without immediately biting, looked more like a mixture of caution and predatory assessment. Even then, the bear returned multiple times over the day and into the night, as if reluctant to surrender what it considered its claim. The bear was clearly acting in defense of what it determined as its food cache. If the two bears were sow and cub, then that may have added to the mix. Speaking of cubs, our Cub Cheer membership on Patreon, link below, will give you ad-free early access to episodes, photos, and notes. And the $3 per month goes a long way in helping me continue to produce educational and entertaining content like this. After reviewing the facts surrounding this attack, I'm left with a few questions for you. How many hunters today would be willing to walk 2 miles into heavy grizzly country, straight to a bloody kill site, without a rifle or even a knife, trusting only a past experience that bears always run? If the same mauling happened now, in an era of satellite messengers and helicopter-ready rescue crews, how different might the outcome be? And how different might our tolerance be for risk and waiting 14.5 hours in the muskeg between life and death? And perhaps hardest of all, what do we make of a man who survives such an ordeal, considers ending his life in the middle of it, and yet chooses, in the end, to go back to the same valley, build a cabin there, with his friends and doctor, and hunt moose again, within sight of the place where a grizzly nearly took everything? I will gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.